Systems that survive for centuries do not do so by accident. They survive because they protect themselves. Language is one of those systems. You probably think of language as a simple tool, something you use to describe the world, to express thoughts, to explain choices. Something mostly neutral, mostly harmless. But many thinkers have pointed out something uncomfortable. Language does not merely reflect reality, it shapes it. What feels real, normal, possible, or completely out of reach is often determined not by facts, but by the structures of language operating inside your mind. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a poetic exaggeration. Language does not just accompany your experience. It filters it. It creates categories you rarely question. It makes certain things visible, and everything outside those categories invisible. You believe you are observing the world, analyzing it, making rational choices. But more often than you realize, you are living inside a system you have never consciously examined. A system that defines the limits of your reality before you even notice they exist. What if the deepest constraints in your life are not external circumstances, not a lack of resources, and not even your habits, but the invisible effects of language you have mistaken for common sense? This book is not about words. It is about language as an environment, not a tool. An environment that quietly shapes your perception, your identity, and the boundaries of what you believe is possible. The moment you understand that language does not simply describe reality, but actively creates it, the question is no longer, what do you want to think? The real question becomes, how was your thinking built in the first place? Chapter 1. You don't use language, you live inside it. There exists a curious paradox in how we perceive our inner voice. When you hear a thought, usually a thought that sounds exactly like your own voice, like your own personal discovery, you naturally assume you created it, that this thought belongs to you, emerges from your unique experience, your understanding of things. But here lies a trap that most people never notice. Hearing a thought does not mean you created it. It may mean only one thing. You are reproducing it. The voice in your head is not your voice. It is the voices of people you heard in childhood, the structures of language into which you were placed before you had the capacity to choose. It is a system that configured you long before your birth. Because languages exist across generations, they pass themselves forward like code, like programs, like a way of organizing thought itself. And by the moment you develop self-awareness, when you first say to yourself, I exist, language is already thoroughly embedded in the architecture of your brain. This happens so early that it feels natural. It happens so smoothly that you never notice the moment when language stopped being a tool and became an environment, when an external system became your internal reality. You did not choose your language. It chose you, if we allow such a metaphor. You did not decide to accept its rules, its categories, its ways of dividing the world into pieces. By the time you gain the ability to decide, language has already built rooms in your brain, rooms in which you will live. The difference between a tool and an environment is critical for understanding everything that follows. A tool is something you pick up, use, and set down again. A hammer is a hammer, and then you put it away. Language works entirely differently. You do not step outside language to use it for thinking. You think inside language, the way a fish swims inside water, the way a bird flies inside air. Water is not a tool for the fish. It is the fish's environment. Similarly, language is not a tool for your thinking. It is the environment in which you exist as a thinking being. And here is why this matters. An environment is invisible. You do not see water until you step out of it. You do not notice air until you cannot breathe. In exactly the same way, you do not see language because you are completely immersed in it. It is the backdrop of all your perception. It is the lens through which you look at the world. But a lens is always invisible to the one looking through it. You see only the picture on the other side of the lens. The lens itself remains unseen. This means you cannot step outside language to see language from the outside. You cannot stand beyond the system and observe it whole. You can only begin to notice how this system influences what you see, what you think, what you consider possible. You can develop an awareness of the system without ever leaving it. You can begin to listen to how language speaks through you without ceasing to speak yourself. When you were an infant, the sounds of language entered your developing consciousness as pure experience. You did not learn language as a set of rules. You absorbed it like a virus. Your brain literally restructured itself in response to the language that surrounded you. Neurons formed new connections, strengthening the pathways useful in your linguistic environment and allowing unused pathways to atrophy and die. If your language made certain distinctions between objects or emotions that another language does not, your brain learned to recognize these distinctions as meaningful. If your language provided no distinction for a particular experience, your brain never developed the neural architecture to make that distinction automatically. By the time you formed your first memories, by the time you began to construct a personality, language had already determined the basic parameters of your perception. It had already selected which differences in the world are meaningful to you and which can be ignored. It had already constructed the basic categories through which you would interpret experience. You did not choose these categories. They were installed in you, and they remain with you, usually invisible, usually unquestioned. Consider the world as an enormous field of information, an infinite array of differences, qualities, relationships, possibilities. Language is not a window through which you observe this field. Language is a filter, a net that captures only certain parts of this field and renders them visible, intelligible, real. Everything else passes through the mesh of the net, remains invisible, unthinkable. You do not see the world directly. You see it through this filter, and the filter determines what you can possibly notice. If your language contains no word for something, if it provides no category for it, then that something exists in the blind spot of your perception. It may be directly in front of you. It may be occurring in your own psyche. But if language has not named it, it remains invisible. Not because you are incapable of seeing it, but because language has not provided you with an instrument to grasp it. Hold it in consciousness, make it real. What is not named remains amorphous, undefined, easily overlooked. This erases the boundary between reality and its linguistic description. You assume there exists some reality, existing independently, which language merely describes with greater or lesser accuracy. But this assumption is dangerously wrong. Language does not describe reality. Language creates the reality that you can perceive. Language forms the categories into which you will sort experience, and then you live inside these categories, believing they are reality itself, rather than a linguistically constructed version of reality. Consider how different languages carve up the world differently. Some languages possess elaborate vocabularies for describing shades and nuances that other languages collapse into a single word. Some languages mark grammatical distinctions that other languages ignore entirely. Some languages provide rich terminology for emotional states that other speakers must struggle to describe, using multiple words to approximate what your language captures in one. This is not accidental. The categories that language provides are the categories that a culture decided were worth noticing, worth naming, worth thinking about carefully. When a language provides a rich vocabulary for something, the speakers of that language think about that thing more frequently, more precisely, more automatically. Their brains are literally organized to process that category of experience more efficiently. When a language provides no word for something, speakers of that language must work harder to think about it, if they think about it at all. They move through the world with certain perceptions sharpened and others dulled, depending entirely on what their language deemed important enough to name. You have never questioned this. You have assumed that the categories your language provides are natural categories, that they reflect the way the world actually is divided. But this is precisely what the system ensures. That you never notice it is a system. The divisions feel inevitable. The distinctions feel obvious. The categories feel like they reflect objective reality rather than linguistic choices made over centuries. Over time, this program becomes so solid that you forget it is a program. You forget that other people, speaking other languages, live in other categories, perceive the world in structurally different ways. You believe you are seeing reality, when in fact, you are seeing the version of reality that your language permits you to see. The boundaries of your language become the boundaries of your world. Everything that exists within these boundaries feels possible, real, logical. Everything that lies beyond these boundaries feels impossible, unreal, irrational. This is especially dangerous because the limitations work softly, invisibly. Language does not command you. It suggests. It does not forbid you from thinking in certain ways. It simply makes certain ways of thinking easier than others. It does not say, "This is impossible." It simply fails to provide you with the categories to even conceive of it as a possibility. The limitations feel like common sense, like logic, like the conclusions of a mature and reasonable person. This is why language works so well, why the system survives across generations, why people typically fail to notice what holds them. It does not oppress them crudely. It does not force them violently. It simply presents its conclusions as reality itself. You do not hear a voice commanding, "You must believe this." You simply hear your own voice saying, "This is obvious. This is normal. This is logical. This is impossible." And because it sounds like you, because this is literally the voice in your own head, you believe it as fact, as truth, as the nature of reality itself. By the time you notice that something feels narrow, that certain paths feel closed, that your life seems to operate within invisible boundaries, language has already completed its work. You have already lived years thinking in certain patterns, repeating certain thoughts, reinforcing certain neural pathways. Language has ordered the architecture of your brain, and now that architecture reproduces the narrative that language gave it. Language has supplied you with conclusions about what you can and cannot do, about who you are and who you will never be, about what is possible and what is absurd, even to attempt. This does not happen through direct command. It does not happen with language telling you, "You are a failure." Rather, language provides you with categories of success, of ability, of the normal path. Then your life is measured against these categories. You feel you do not fit. And instead of questioning the categories, because the categories seem like objective facts, not linguistic constructions, you question yourself. You judge yourself as wrong, deficient, incapable. Language has won, and you never even knew there was a battle. But there is a moment when this can begin to shift. A moment when you can begin to see language, rather than as reality itself. When you can begin to notice how it filters your perception, how it shapes your categories, how it structures your thoughts. This does not happen through replacing bad thoughts with good ones. This locks you inside the same linguistic framework, simply inverted. This happens through developing distance from your thoughts, through the ability to observe them as objects rather than identifying with them completely. When you hear the thought, "I am not capable of this," the first step is simply noticing. Noticing that you hear the thought. Not "I believe this," not "this is true," but simply "I am telling myself this." Because the moment you notice that you are telling yourself this, it becomes possible to see that this thought is something you are reproducing, not a truth you are discovering. It becomes possible to ask, where did this thought come from? Who planted it in me? On what basis do I keep repeating it? This distance, small, barely perceptible, is the place where change begins to become possible. Not because a new thought will immediately allow you to succeed, but because distance shows you that you are not completely chained to the thoughts you have, that there exists a part of you that can observe these thoughts, can see them as constructions, can realize that they are not a verdict on reality, but a program that was installed in you. And if they can be noticed, if they can be deconstructed, then they can be altered. Language will not disappear. You cannot exit language. It is impossible and unnecessary. But you can begin to see language as choice rather than destiny. You can begin to notice which words you repeat to yourself, which categories they create, how they narrow your vision of what is possible. You can begin to hear where language speaks from habit, where it reproduces old programs, where it protects its own stability instead of serving your freedom. And in this noticing, in this vision of a system that was always invisible, in this realization that you do not live in reality, but in a linguistic version of reality, in this lies the first crack in the wall. Not to escape, but to begin to see that the wall is not built of stone. It is built of words, and words can be reconsidered. But before we can reconsider words, we must understand exactly how they work. How they do not merely name things, but create the very reality that we perceive. How one word can open an entire world, while its absence can keep an entire world in blindness. This is the mechanism that underlies everything else. This is where the real system begins to reveal itself. Chapter 2. Words don't describe reality. They create it. There is a fundamental mistake embedded in how almost everyone thinks about the relationship between words and reality. You assume a certain order of events. First, something happens in the world. Then, you perceive it. Then, you describe it with language. The language comes last, serving as a tool to capture what is already there. But this sequence is almost entirely backwards. Consider what actually occurs when something happens to you. You lose a job. A project falls through. Someone rejects you. The event itself is neutral. It is simply information, a shift in circumstances. Nothing in the event itself contains meaning. Meaning does not exist in the circumstances. Meaning emerges only in the moment you step back to make sense of what occurred. And in that moment, language arrives. Language does not arrive to describe something that is already real. Language arrives to construct reality itself. You will say either, "I failed," or "I was unlucky," or "this wasn't right for me." You might say, "The market wasn't ready," or "the timing was wrong," or "I learned something valuable." These are not different descriptions of the same reality. These are genuinely different realities. The same circumstance has become 3 or 10 entirely different experiences, depending on which words you chose to frame it with. The event was the same. The reality you will live inside is not the same. And here is the dangerous part. You believe you chose the words to match the reality. You believe you searched for accurate language to describe what happened. But what actually occurred is reversed. The words did not follow the reality. The words created the reality. The moment you said, "I failed," the failure became real. Before that moment, there was only an event, a circumstance, a shift in information, something that happened. No meaning attached, no narrative, no identity implications. Then language arrived and decided what it all meant. And in deciding, language created the reality that you would experience. This is not metaphorical or poetic. The neuroscience is unambiguous. Your brain does not process raw, pre-linguistic reality and then apply language to it as a secondary layer. Your brain constructs an experience by interpreting events through linguistic categories. When something happens to you, your brain immediately searches for the linguistic frame that will make sense of it. The words you habitually use determine which neural pathways activate in response. If you frame an event as a failure, certain emotional and cognitive systems light up: shame, self-doubt, withdrawal. If you frame the identical event as redirection, different systems activate: curiosity, openness, forward momentum. The experience is not the same because the language was not the same. Your brain literally processes the same event differently depending on the linguistic frame you apply to it. This is why two people can live through an identical situation and have utterly incompatible lives as a result. Not because they have different personalities or inherent capacities, but because they spoke about the situation using different language. One person's contract is not renewed and says to themselves, "I was pushed out. This company didn't value me. I was rejected." Another person's contract is not renewed and says, "I'm finally free from work that wasn't aligned with what I want to do." This opens new possibilities. The event is identical. The experienced reality is incompatible. One person will spend months questioning their worth. The other will spend that same time exploring what comes next. Their futures diverge not because the circumstance created different outcomes, but because language created different selves. And those different selves will make different choices, will encounter different possibilities, will construct different futures. Language does not explain your experience. It creates the form that your experience takes. This is why failure is not universally experienced as tragedy. For some people, failure is experienced as information, as direction, as the price of attempting something meaningful. For others, failure is experienced as confirmation of inadequacy, as proof of incapacity, as evidence that they should not have tried. The failure is identical. The experience is not. The difference lies entirely in the language available to interpret what happened. And the language available to you is not random. It was installed in you. It comes from how you were spoken to, what you were told about yourself, what narratives were embedded in your family and culture. But there is something even more sinister at work than the framing of what has already happened. Language also determines what you can even conceive of happening in the future. It creates invisible walls around the space of possibilities. These walls are so seamless that you do not experience them as walls at all. You experience them as reality, as the way things actually are. You have an idea, to change direction, to try something new, to leave something comfortable because it no longer serves you. The idea forms in your mind, not fully articulated yet. And then, before you have even completely thought it through, language appears with its verdict. Let's be realistic. 3 words. That small phrase. And suddenly, the entire space of what seems possible has shrunk dramatically. The conversation is over before it began, not because the idea was analyzed and rejected on its merits, not because evidence was presented that it would not work, but because language closed the door on the very possibility of considering it seriously. The word realistic is doing more work than you realize. It is not describing the world. It is describing the boundaries of what you are permitted to consider. Realistic means in accordance with what is possible. But what is possible is itself determined by language, not by reality. What is realistic is what your linguistic community has decided is realistic. What is realistic is what has been done before, what is familiar, what fits within existing categories. Everything else is dismissed as unrealistic, which is to say, as not fitting within the linguistic frame that your community has constructed. After a certain age, and you know this age, you have felt it arrive. The word realistic becomes the primary tool through which you discard possibilities without examination. We have to be realistic about what's achievable at our age. Let's look at this realistically. That's not how the world works. I wish I could do that, but I have to be realistic. The word realistic does not argue. It does not provide evidence. It does not engage with the specifics of your situation. It simply announces that certain options are outside the realm of possibility. It declares them unrealistic. And because it sounds measured, adult, wise, because it sounds like reality itself speaking through the voice of maturity and experience, you accept the verdict without question. But realistic is not reality. Realistic is language. It is a linguistic frame that a culture decided to build around what is supposedly possible. And like all linguistic frames, it is arbitrary and contingent. It reflects decisions made by people long dead, decisions about what people like you can and cannot do. What is normal for your age, your background, your type, your gender, your class? These decisions were encoded into language. They were embedded in the words you inherited, and now that language speaks through you as if it is objective truth, as if it is simply how the world works. But it is not how the world works. It is how language has decided the world should be perceived. The word normal works the same way, often even more subtly and insidiously. You want to dress differently, behave differently, choose a different path than those around you. You want to take a risk, to deviate from the expected trajectory. But before you have even fully considered the possibility, language has already decided. That's not normal. People will think it's strange. Normal does not forbid anything directly. Normal does not say, you cannot. Normal simply renders alternatives invisible. It says, that is not how things are done. And in that statement, the option ceases to exist in your mind as a genuine possibility. You do not consciously sit down and weigh the option, then reject it. You simply fail to see it as viable. The language has already made the choice for you before you were even aware that a choice existed. This is how language functions as a silent censor. Not through prohibition. Prohibition would be visible, would generate resistance. Language censors through invisibility. The things that fall outside the boundaries of your language, the boundaries of what your language calls normal, realistic, appropriate, possible. These things do not appear to you as options at all. They appear, if they appear at all, as oddities, as impractical fantasies, as the choices of people who have not yet learned to see the world as it really is. But the world as it really is already filtered through language. You are seeing a linguistically constructed version of reality and mistaking it for objective fact. You are looking at a map and believing you are looking at the territory. And gradually, imperceptibly, words stop describing your life and start becoming your life. You say, I am not the kind of person who does that. And it becomes true. Not because it was true before you said it. not because some fixed essence of your personality prevents it, but because you have now built it into your identity through language. You have constructed a linguistic identity. The words harden. They become self-reinforcing. Every time you encounter a situation that might challenge this identity, your language activates automatically. That's not me. I don't do things like that. That's not who I am. And you move on, never fully considering the possibility, never testing whether this linguistic identity is actually binding or merely habitual. Think about the sentences you regularly use to describe yourself. I'm not creative. I'm not good with people. I've never been able to do that. That's just how I am. I'm not the type to take risks. I don't have the personality for that. These are not observations about yourself. These are not discoveries of some pre-existing essence. These are linguistic constructions. And the moment you speak them, especially the moment you speak them repeatedly, in the presence of others, in the privacy of your own mind, they become scaffolding. They become the framework within which you interpret new information, new opportunities, new possible versions of yourself. If someone suggests you try something that contradicts this linguistic self-description, the language activates automatically, like a reflex. That's not me. I could never do that. That's not really my thing. And the possibility is closed before it was ever truly open. The language prevents you from even testing whether the identity you have constructed through words is actually true or simply habitual. You have built a prison of language, and now you defend the prison because you have come to believe that the prison is you. You trust your thoughts when they sound logical, when they sound measured and adult and reasonable. This is the final and most insidious trap. When you think, if I was capable of doing this, I would have done it by now. It sounds logical. It feels like a reasonable inference drawn from evidence, like something you have observed about yourself over years. But it is not. It is a conclusion that only makes sense inside a particular linguistic frame, a frame in which your past completely determines your future, in which what you have not yet done is ironclad proof that you cannot do it. But this frame is not reality. It is language pretending to be logic. And the danger is that you cannot see this from inside the frame. From inside, everything looks like observation. The thoughts feel like facts. The conclusions feel like inevitable. The limitations feel like understanding, like hard-won wisdom about how the world works and what is possible. This is the most powerful aspect of how language works. It does not feel like language. It does not feel like a system you are trapped in. It feels like reality. Your own thoughts sound like your voice, like your genuine discoveries, like your authentic understanding of how the world works and what you are capable of. And so you trust them, absolutely. You defend them. You live inside them. And they become more and more real. But here is where the ground becomes unstable. Here is where the system reveals its contingency. If your entire experience of reality is constructed through language, if what you perceive, what you believe is possible, who you understand yourself to be, what feels normal and what feels strange, if all of this is assembled through words, then none of it was inevitable. It could have been assembled differently. Someone else, speaking in a different language, living in a different linguistic community, inheriting different words, would inhabit an entirely different reality in the same circumstances. The specifics of your life, the limits you perceive, the possibilities you cannot see. These are not facts about the world. They are artifacts of language. This realization is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it removes the ground beneath you. There is no solid reality to stand on, no objective constraints to blame for your limitations, no external world that is simply the way it is and therefore cannot be changed. There is only language, endlessly constructing, endlessly defining what is real and what is impossible, what is possible and what is unthinkable. And liberating because if reality is constructed, if it was built through words, then it can be rebuilt through different words. The construction is not permanent. The walls are not stone. The boundaries are not natural laws. They are made of language, and language can change. But before anything changes, before you can even begin to reconstruct your reality, you must first see the words that are currently constructing it. You must become aware of the language you are using moment by moment to describe yourself, your situation, your possibilities. Not to judge it, not to replace bad words with good words. That is still working within the same linguistic framework, simply shifting the polarity. That is still accepting that language constructs reality, but asking it to construct a better one. But simply to see it, to notice that the words are there, to recognize that you are using them, rather than being unconsciously used by them. What words do you speak most frequently when you describe yourself? What language do you use when you encounter a situation that challenges you or frightens you? Do you retreat into words of limitation? I can't. That's not me. I've never been good at that. That's not realistic? Or do you reach toward words of possibility, even tentatively, even uncertainly, even while doubting yourself? These are not small questions. These words are not trivial. They are the material from which your reality is being constructed every single day. They are the bricks from which the walls of your life are built. And if words have been quietly assembling your reality without your awareness, if you have been living in a linguistically constructed world and mistaking it for objective fact, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Which words are being used? Which ones are doing the work of construction automatically, beneath conscious attention, so familiar that they feel like truth rather than language? Which ones have been passed down to you, inherited from people and communities and eras you never chose? Which ones are still operating, invisible and powerful, to define the boundaries of what you think is possible? These words are not random. They follow patterns. They repeat themselves. They have been passed down through generations. They are encoded in your family stories, your cultural assumptions, your professional environments. And in understanding how they work, how they grip, how they limit, in that understanding lies the beginning of something else entirely. Because once you see the words, you begin to see the system. And once you see the system, you can no longer fully inhabit it unconsciously. Chapter 3. The Language Parasite. How words hijack your thinking. You have noticed something, perhaps without fully articulating it. Certain thoughts return to you, again and again, across years. Even when your circumstances change dramatically, even when you have moved to different places or changed jobs or ended relationships, the same thoughts rise up from inside you with familiar persistence. They sound so familiar that they feel intimate, like the voice of your own experience, your own hard-won understanding. You trust them precisely because they have been with you so long. But here lies a critical distinction that most people never make. A thought that has lived inside you for decades is not more likely to be true. It is more likely to have become invisible. Consider the nature of what you call thinking. You assume that your thoughts belong to you, that they originate from your individual experience, your personality, your authentic self. But what if most of what you experience as thinking is not thinking at all, but reproduction? What if the thoughts you trust most deeply are not your discoveries, but transmissions? Systems operating inside your consciousness that continue to operate not because they serve you, but because they have become self-perpetuating. This is what parasitism means. Not evil, not malevolent. A parasite simply uses the host as a vehicle for its own continuation. The parasite has no interest in your well-being. It has no investment in your freedom or your happiness or your growth. It is interested only in one thing: persisting, continuing to exist, reproducing itself. A virus does not ask whether infecting you is good for you. It simply uses the resources of your body to make copies of itself. And it is remarkably good at it. Language operates in precisely this way. Not consciously, not with intention, but with perfect effectiveness. Language uses you. Language uses your brain, your vocal cords, your attention, your internal dialogue. And language reproduces itself through you, over and over, ensuring its own continuation across generations. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a plot. It is simply how the system works. Language evolved to replicate itself. And you are the medium of that replication. But here is what makes language especially powerful as a parasite. It is invisible from the inside. You cannot see it because you are completely filled with it. You cannot step outside it to observe it. You can only begin to notice its effects. To notice that certain thoughts return endlessly, that certain conclusions feel inevitable, that certain questions never quite form themselves in your mind. You begin to notice patterns of thinking that were never consciously chosen, yet persist with remarkable stubbornness. Listen to how you talk to yourself. Actually listen, not to the content of your thoughts, but to their structure, their repetition, their formulation. You will hear phrases that sound like you, but that you never actually chose to say. This is just how people are. The world doesn't work that way. I've never been good at that. That's not realistic. People like me don't do things like that. These are not your original observations. These are formulas, pre-assembled structures of language that you have inherited, absorbed, and now reproduce. Where did you get these formulas? You cannot remember. They have been with you so long that they feel like they came from your own experience. But trace them backward, to conversations you half remember, to parents or teachers or friends, to cultural narratives you absorbed without noticing, to the zeitgeist of your formative years. These formulas were installed in you, and now they live inside you as if they are you. They have become so integrated into your sense of self that you defend them with the energy of defending yourself. Consider a specific formula. People don't change. You have probably heard this. You have probably said it. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like wisdom born from experience. Like you have observed enough of human behavior to know that fundamental change is rare, difficult, perhaps impossible. But if you examine this formula closely, you will find that it is not actually based on careful observation. It is a pre-assembled linguistic unit that you inherited. And once it is lodged in your mind, it does exactly what it was designed to do. It prevents you from conceiving of change in others or yourself. It closes down the space of possibility. It makes certain futures unthinkable. Or consider, I'm just not that kind of person. This formula is extraordinarily powerful because it sounds like a discovery about yourself. It sounds like you have examined yourself carefully and identified a core truth about your nature. But what is it really? It is a linguistic structure that takes something fluid, your behavior, your capacities, your habits, and transforms it into something fixed. Your identity, your essence, your nature. Every time you repeat this formula, you reinforce it. Every time you encounter a situation where you might do something that kind of person would do, the formula activates automatically. That's not me. I'm not that kind of person. And the possibility is foreclosed. The most insidious aspect of these formulas is that they operate automatically, beneath conscious attention. You do not sit down and consciously decide to apply the formula, "I'm not creative." The formula is activated the moment the situation arises. Someone suggests you try a creative task. Before you have even fully considered it, the thought appears, "I'm not creative. Why would I bother trying?" The thought feels like observation. It feels like you are being realistic about yourself. But what is actually occurring is that a linguistic program is running. A formula is being executed, and you are experiencing the output as truth. This is the mechanism of the parasite. It does not force you or command you. It simply provides thoughts that seem to come from you, and you execute them. You believe the thoughts because they sound like your voice. You defend them because they feel like yourself. But they are not. They are formulas, running on autopilot, reproducing themselves through your internal dialogue. Your internal dialogue is the primary mechanism through which language reproduces itself. It is the mechanism through which these parasitic formulas perpetuate. You talk to yourself constantly, narrating, explaining, justifying, predicting. And in that internal conversation, you repeat the same phrases, deploy the same arguments, reach the same conclusions. You rarely surprise yourself with a genuinely novel thought. Instead, you cycle through familiar patterns. This won't work because I'm not the type to. People would think, these are not fresh thoughts arising from your engagement with the world. These are reruns, broadcasts of old programs. And here is the trap. The more you repeat these thoughts, the more real they become. Neuroscience calls this the mere exposure effect. The tendency to develop a preference for something simply because you have been exposed to it repeatedly. Repeat a formula enough times, and it becomes more believable, more real, more you. It carves deeper grooves in your neural pathways. It becomes more automatic. It requires less and less conscious effort to activate. Eventually, the thought arises without any sense that it is arising. It simply appears, as if it is your direct perception of reality. This is why these formulas feel like maturity, like wisdom, like the hard-won conclusions of experience. They feel this way because repetition has made them solid. Familiarity has made them feel profound. But they are not profound. They are simply well-worn. They are like paths that have been walked so many times that they appear to be the only possible routes through the forest. But the forest is much larger than these paths. And there are directions in which you have never walked. Not because it is impossible to walk there, but because the language available to you has never suggested it. What makes these formulas especially effective as parasitic organisms is that they feel like sanity, like rationality, like seeing the world as it is. When you say, "I should be realistic," you are not experiencing this as a linguistic formula. You are experiencing it as the voice of reason, as the voice of maturity, as the voice of someone who understands how the world actually works, as opposed to how naive people wish it worked. This is the camouflage of the parasite. It wears the mask of wisdom. It sounds like you have learned something hard about life. It sounds like you are protecting yourself from disappointment. But this is precisely how the system ensures its own continuation. If the formulas sounded obviously alien, if they sounded like impositions, you would resist them. you would recognize them as something other than yourself. But because they sound like your voice, like your conclusions, like your understanding, you accept them as yourself. You defend them. You pass them on to others. The parasite reproduces itself not through force, but through your genuine belief that it is you. After 40 or 50 years of repetition, these formulas have moved beyond belief into something closer to structural assumption. They no longer feel like ideas that you hold. They feel like facts about reality. They feel like the way the world is organized. Someone suggests you try something new. The formula activates, "People don't change, that's just life." The formula no longer feels like a statement you are making. It feels like observation. It feels like reality. It feels like common sense. This is what happens when a thought has had decades to establish itself. It becomes invisible not because it is hidden, but because it is so familiar that you stop noticing it. It becomes the background of your consciousness, as invisible and ubiquitous as the air you breathe. You do not experience it as a thought anymore. You experience it as the structure of reality itself. You experience it as how things are. But there is a tell. There is a way to recognize when a thought is a parasitic formula rather than a genuine observation. The tell is rigidity. Parasitic formulas do not tolerate questions. They do not open up into deeper inquiry. They close inquiry down. When you ask yourself, "Is this really true?" about a parasitic formula, the formula immediately provides a defense, an answer, a reason why questioning is misguided. This is just how the world works. I've tried before and it didn't work. That's being naive. People like me don't do that. The formula is always ready with an answer that prevents further examination. This is the parasite protecting itself. When you attempt to question it, it does not engage with your question. It simply provides another formula, a meta-formula that explains why the original formula cannot be questioned. It is remarkably effective, almost foolproof, because the moment you try to doubt, the formula provides the doubt a home within the larger system. It absorbs the doubt. It explains the doubt. It turns the doubt into further evidence for the formula. See? Even when you try to believe something could be different, you can sense how unrealistic it is. Sometimes, however, something shifts. Sometimes you catch a glimpse. Sometimes there is a moment, usually fleeting, where you hear a thought as if from outside yourself, where the thought does not feel like you, but like something operating inside you. You hear a familiar phrase, a familiar conclusion, and for just an instant, you recognize it as a pattern, not as truth, not as you, but as a pattern, a formula, a program running. These moments are rare and usually brief. The system recovers quickly. The formula reintegrates. The thought returns to feeling like you. But in that moment of recognition, something has changed. You have glimpsed the apparatus. You have seen that there is machinery operating inside your consciousness. And you cannot fully unknow that. You cannot fully return to the state where the formulas felt like unquestionable truth. This is not freedom yet, but it is the beginning of freedom. It is the crack in the system. Because the moment you recognize that a thought is a pattern, the thought has less power over you. Not because you have replaced it with a better thought, but because you have introduced distance between yourself and the thought. You have created a gap, and in that gap lies the possibility of something else. But here is what you must understand. You cannot simply remove these parasitic formulas. You cannot think them out of existence. You cannot argue with them until they disappear. The system is too integrated. These formulas are too woven into your consciousness. Trying to fight them directly is like fighting a viral infection with willpower. The system will only strengthen its defenses. What you can do is notice them. You can develop the capacity to observe when a formula is activating. You can hear the moment a thought is rising up from the depths of your conditioned mind, rather than arising from genuine engagement with the present moment. You can create space between the activation of the formula and your automatic response to it. That space, small, barely perceptible, is where the parasite loses its grip. Not because you have defeated it, but because you have stopped feeding it with your unconscious identification. This is not a battle you will win, but it is a relationship you can change. You can stop being a transparent vehicle for the reproduction of parasitic thoughts. You can become aware of the moment when language begins to speak through you, and in that awareness, you cease to be merely a host. You become something more like a witness, and a witness is far more difficult for a parasite to use. The question that begins to matter is not, is this thought true? The question becomes, am I thinking this? Or is this formula thinking itself through me? Can you hear the difference? Can you notice the moment when a thought arises from your genuine engagement with the situation, and the moment when a pre-recorded formula activates automatically? The moment you can distinguish between these two. The moment you can observe the pattern without immediately identifying with it. In that moment, the system begins to lose its absolute dominion over you. This is the work ahead. Not to think positive thoughts or to replace bad thoughts with good thoughts. This is still fighting within the system. This is still accepting that language constructs reality, but hoping it will construct a better one. The real work is to develop the capacity to notice when language is operating, when formulas are activating, when you are being spoken through rather than speaking. It is to build a relationship with the parasitic system that no longer rests entirely on unconscious identification. And what emerges from this? Not certainty, not positive thinking, but something far more valuable, the possibility of choice. Not in the sense of choosing different thoughts. You have no direct control over what thoughts arise, but in the sense of choosing your relationship to the thoughts that do arise. Choosing whether to identify with them completely or to observe them with a degree of distance. Choosing whether to let the formula execute automatically or to pause and recognize what is actually happening. This is where genuine freedom begins, not in fighting the parasite, but in ceasing to be unconsciously occupied by it, in developing the capacity to see it operating, in recognizing that you are larger than the formulas that run inside you. This awareness is the first real tool you possess, not to eliminate the parasite, that is impossible, but to stop being fully consumed by it. Chapter 4. Seeing the system. How awareness creates space for choice. Most people misunderstand what awareness actually is. They think awareness means understanding something new, reaching a conclusion, forming a better opinion about how things work. They imagine it as a mental achievement, something you accomplish through analysis or insight. But awareness is not a new thought. It is not a conclusion. It is a shift in position, a change in the relationship between you and the thoughts that arise inside your mind. You do not replace one set of thoughts with another. You step slightly to the side of thought itself. This confusion between awareness and understanding creates a particular trap. You read something that rings true. You nod along. You tell yourself, yes, I understand this. I see how language constructs my reality. I recognize the formulas operating inside me. And then you return to your life and discover that nothing has changed. You are still operating entirely within the system. Your recognition of the system has become just another thought, another piece of information filed away, while the machinery continues running uninterrupted. Understanding can coexist with complete automaticity. Awareness is different. Awareness is not something you understand and then file away. Awareness is something you practice moment by moment, or it disappears. Consider the difference between being inside a thought and observing a thought. When you are inside a thought, the thought is reality. It fills your entire field of perception. There is no distance, no separation, no possibility of questioning its truth. The thought speaks, and you experience it as the world speaking. But when you observe a thought, something fundamental changes. The thought becomes an event, something that occurs inside your consciousness, like a cloud passing through the sky. You see it arise, you see its content, you see it pass, and in seeing it this way, you are no longer contained within it. Imagine receiving a message or hearing a phrase that would normally trigger an immediate reaction: irritation, defense, withdrawal. The familiar thought arises automatically, carrying all its usual emotional charge. But this time, something different happens. You notice the thought itself appearing, rather than being swept immediately into its content. You do not fight the thought. You do not attempt to replace it with something positive. You simply register that it has appeared. And in that registration, you do not respond right away. The usual chain, thought to reaction to behavior, is interrupted, not by effort, but by simple presence. This interruption reveals something essential about how the system operates. The parasitic formulas from the previous chapter work with such efficiency precisely because they remain unnoticed. They activate automatically. They execute without resistance. They reproduce themselves through your unexamined identification with them. Awareness does not destroy these formulas. It does not argue with them. It simply shines a light on their operation. And light does not eliminate shadow. It simply makes the shadow visible. The system no longer possesses the totality it once had. You can now see its contours. The system weakens not because you understand it better, but because you see it operating. A parasite thrives in the dark, in automaticity, in unconscious repetition, in the seamless integration of host and parasite. When you begin to notice the moment of activation, when you register the formula arising rather than immediately becoming it, the seamlessness breaks. The system no longer operates in the background as unquestioned reality. It operates in the foreground as something observable. This does not make the formulas disappear. It makes them observable. And what is observable is no longer absolute. Between the arising of a thought and your reaction to it, a pause sometimes appears. This pause is not something you create through willpower. It is not a technique you apply. It emerges naturally when awareness is present. Consider standing before a familiar choice: to agree when you want to refuse, to justify when you want to be silent, to withdraw when you want to engage. The habitual formula activates immediately. This is how it always is. Better not to make waves. That's just how I am. But this time, you notice the formula before acting on it. You do not do anything new or different. You simply refrain from the automatic response. Nothing is resolved. Nothing is improved. The situation remains exactly as it was. But the automation did not complete its cycle. This pause is where space begins to appear. And in this space, something unexpected often happens. there is an emptiness, a void. The void that usually gets filled immediately by the next formula, the next narrative, the next response. But for a moment, it remains unfilled. And the mind wants to fill it. The mind wants to resolve this emptiness. It reaches for something to do, something to decide, something to conclude. It wants to return to the familiar ground of formulas and predetermined responses. The emptiness feels wrong. It feels unstable. It feels like you are not doing what you are supposed to be doing. But this discomfort with emptiness is precisely what allows the system to maintain itself. The moment an empty space appears, the formula rushes in to fill it. And in rushing in, it prevents you from experiencing what might exist in that space if you could tolerate it without filling it. The ability to remain in the pause, to refrain from filling the emptiness, is not a skill you develop through practice. It is a capacity that gradually becomes available as you age. This is not loss. This is not weakness. After 40, something shifts. You no longer need to have the answer immediately. You no longer need to resolve the situation right now. You care less about winning the argument, about having the last word, about proving yourself correct. Not because you have become wiser or more spiritual, but because the urgency has softened. The desperation to fill every empty moment with action or decision has begun to release. You become more able to sit with not knowing, more willing to let something remain uncertain, more capable of tolerating the space between stimulus and response without immediately filling it with a formula. This is not control. This is not mastery or discipline. It is simply the quiet gift that time offers, the ability to move slightly slower through your own reactions, to not need everything resolved before the next moment arrives, to tolerate the strange emptiness of not immediately knowing what you think or what you should do. This capacity is not spiritual achievement. It is maturity. And maturity, in this sense, is a genuine resource. It is something that your younger self could not have accessed. The price of age is the slowness it brings. But in that slowness lies the possibility of awareness. Awareness does not make life easier. It does not remove fear or doubt or uncertainty. It does not guarantee better outcomes or clearer decisions. What it does is restore alternatives that had become invisible. It removes the sensation that there is only one possible interpretation, one inevitable response, one predetermined path. You no longer live entirely inside the single narrative constructed by your habitual language. Multiple narratives become visible, not as ideals to strive toward, but as actual possibilities that were always present, though previously obscured. The most common mistake is to treat awareness as a technique, something you apply, activate, use strategically to achieve better results. This misunderstanding returns you immediately to the system. You begin trying to be aware at the right moments, to notice your thoughts when it serves your goals. Awareness cannot be used this way. It cannot be deployed like a tool. The moment you attempt to use it, you have returned to identification with outcome, with improvement, with control. Awareness is not a technique. It is a state of presence that either is or is not. The first signs that space has begun to appear are subtle, almost invisible to others. Thoughts that once felt absolutely convincing now carry a slight question mark. Reactions that were once instantaneous now include a fraction of hesitation. Even your familiar choices begin to feel like choices rather than the only possible response. You notice yourself saying, "I see what is happening here." Not as a dramatic revelation, but as a simple registration of what is occurring. These are not transformations. They are not achievements. They are quiet indications that something has shifted at the level of perception. Awareness is not a single insight or moment of enlightenment. It is closer to a capacity that develops through simple repetition, not the repetition of formulas, but the repetition of noticing. One moment of seeing through a formula is not enough. The automation returns. The familiarity reasserts itself. But each moment of noticing leaves a trace. Each registration of a formula as formula rather than truth accumulates. You do not force this development. You do not strive for it. You simply continue showing up for what is occurring, continuing to notice what arises. You do not exit language. You do not destroy the system. You do not become free of thought. What occurs is something quieter, more enduring. You cease to be completely merged with the system. You develop the capacity to stand alongside your thinking rather than entirely within it. The parasitic formulas continue to arise. The habitual narratives continue to activate. But you are no longer their transparent vehicle. There exists now a perspective from which they can be seen operating. If awareness creates this space, if it introduces the possibility of standing alongside rather than entirely within your language, then the next step becomes clear. You must become familiar with the specific words and formulas that most reliably close this space, the phrases that most automatically execute themselves, the linguistic structures that have become so practiced they operate without your consent. These are not abstract dangers. They are concrete. They are habitual. They are happening right now. And seeing them clearly, seeing exactly how they work, exactly when they activate, exactly what they protect, this is where the space begins to widen. Chapter 5. The words that close the space. Everyday language that quietly limits you. The space that awareness creates is real, but it is fragile. It appears when you notice the formula activating, when you pause before the automatic response. And then, almost immediately, it closes. Not because you have failed, not because you lack discipline, but because language activates again, and with it, the closure returns. The space does not close because of circumstances or events. It closes because a new formula has arrived to explain why the space does not matter, why it was only temporary, why you must return to the familiar ground of predetermined responses. This closure happens so smoothly that you barely notice it. One moment you are standing in the pause, observing your habitual thought. The next moment, a new thought arrives. A phrase that sounds reasonable, that sounds like wisdom, that sounds like seeing things as they really are. And the space contracts. The possibility recedes. You are back inside the system, and the system feels like reality again. Understanding which words create this closure is not about condemning the words. These words are not evil. They are not hostile. They are simply extraordinarily effective at restoring the system's totality. They sound so reasonable that you accept them without question. They feel so accurate that you mistake them for observation rather than construction. And in that moment of acceptance, the space collapses. Consider the phrase, "be realistic." It appears in so many contexts that you hardly notice it anymore. In meetings, in conversations with yourself, in moments when you consider doing something different. Let's be realistic about what's possible. The phrase does not argue with you. It does not provide evidence or analysis. It does not enter into discussion about what realistic actually means. It simply announces that you have crossed into unrealistic territory. And in that announcement, the option ceases to exist as something worth considering. Realistic is not a conclusion you reach through careful analysis. Realistic is a boundary, a line that separates what is permitted to think about from what is beyond the pale of acceptable consideration. What makes this phrase so effective is that it sounds like seeing clearly. It sounds like maturity. It sounds like you are protecting yourself from disappointment by facing facts. But what it actually does is foreclose inquiry. The moment someone says, "Let's be realistic," the conversation narrows. Possibilities that were being entertained disappear, not because they were examined and rejected, but because they have been declared unrealistic. And unrealistic means you should not waste your energy on it. Unrealistic means it is not worth thinking about. Unrealistic is the linguistic way of saying, "Stop here." Then there is the phrase, "That's just how it is." It appears in response to observations, to complaints, to moments when you suggest that something could be different. People are selfish. That's just how humans are. Life is unfair. That's just how it is. I've always been anxious. That's just how I am. The phrase takes an interpretation and transforms it into a fact. It takes something that is observed in a particular context and universalizes it into law. An interpretation becomes the way things are. And the moment something becomes the way things are, it ceases to be something you might question or explore or understand differently. What is dangerous about this phrase is that it stops inquiry cold. It does not invite deeper examination. It does not open up discussion. It closes it. The phrase announces finality. It says, "This is the boundary of what is knowable about this. Beyond this boundary lies only fantasy or wishful thinking." And in that announcement, you return completely to the system. Your brief moment of seeing clearly through the formula has passed, and you are submerged again in the idea that things cannot be otherwise. Consider, "I'm not that kind of person." This phrase appears whenever you encounter something you might do but have never done before. It is a formulation that takes a habit and transforms it into an identity. Something you have not done becomes something you cannot do, because it is not who you are. Your behavior becomes your essence. Your history becomes your destiny. And the phrase serves a particular function. It prevents experimentation. It prevents the possibility that you might be different from how you have previously been. It freezes you into the interpretation of yourself that language has constructed. The power of this phrase lies in how it feels like truth. It does not feel like a limitation. It feels like self-knowledge. It feels like you have examined yourself and arrived at an accurate understanding of your nature. But what has actually occurred is that a linguistic formula has calcified your sense of who you are. Every time you repeat it, it becomes more solid. Every time you use it as a reason not to try something, it becomes more true. The phrase creates the very reality it claims to be observing. People don't change. This phrase has the authority of observation. It sounds like wisdom drawn from experience. You have watched people struggle, make resolutions, return to their old patterns. You have seen this cycle repeat. And from this observation, you have extracted a universal law. People do not change. What began as a specific observation becomes a universal truth. And once it becomes a universal truth, it applies not just to others, but to you. If people do not change, then you will not change. The phrase sounds like clear-eyed realism, but it functions as a prophecy. It does not describe the world as it is. It describes the world as it will be. And in describing it this way, it helps ensure that this is indeed how it will be. The phrase works because it sounds irrefutable. How can you argue with simple observation? How can you contest evidence drawn from years of watching human nature? But the observation is selective. You are not seeing all the ways people change. You are seeing the changes that conform to your category, people do not change. and you are not seeing the changes that fall outside this category. The lens through which you observe has already decided what counts as evidence and what does not. Then there is, "at my age." This phrase uses time as an argument. Age becomes the explanation. Age becomes the reason. I can't start something new at my age. At my age, you don't risk everything. People my age don't do that. What is happening here is subtle. Age is not being used as context. It is being used as cause. It is being transformed from a fact about how long you have lived into a reason why you cannot do certain things. And the phrase closes off discussion. What could you say in response? Age is a fact. You cannot argue with a fact. But age is not actually an argument. Age is a circumstance. What the phrase does is transform a circumstance into an inevitability. It says, because you have lived this long, certain paths are now closed. And in saying this, it prevents you from even asking whether the paths might still be open. It prevents you from testing whether the limitation is real or constructed. It allows you to accept the closure without examination, because age seems like an external fact, not a linguistic choice. It's not the right time. This phrase appears whenever something appeals to you, but also feels uncertain or difficult. It is a way of saying, I am not going to do this right now. But the phrase transforms a decision about timing into a statement about reality. It suggests that time itself is working against you, that there is a right time that exists somewhere in the future. And this is not it. The phrase is designed to comfort. It suggests that you are not saying no permanently, only saying not yet. But not yet rarely arrives. The right time is always somewhere ahead, always slightly out of reach, always dependent on circumstances that will align at some undefined future moment. What the phrase prevents is inquiry into what would make this the right time. What would need to happen? What conditions are you actually waiting for? Most often, if you examine it, the conditions you are waiting for are not conditions at all. They are feelings. You are waiting to feel more confident, more ready, more certain. And these feelings are not dependent on time. They are dependent on action. But the phrase allows you to avoid this recognition. It allows you to postpone without fully acknowledging that you are postponing indefinitely. I don't really have a choice emerges when faced with decisions that feel simultaneously important and constrained. It is a phrase that announces the absence of alternatives. And in announcing this absence, it makes the choice feel less like a choice and more like a necessity. You are not deciding. You are simply responding to how things are. The phrase relieves you of agency, but it also relieves you of responsibility. If you have no choice, then whatever happens is not your doing. You were forced. You had no alternative. But examine this phrase closely, and you often find that the alternatives are not absent. They are simply not acknowledged. They are considered briefly and then dismissed as worse than the option you are accepting. I have no choice but to stay in this job. But the choice is between staying and a hypothetical future of uncertainty and financial risk. The choice exists, but the phrase allows you to experience yourself as having no choice. It allows you to experience the situation as determined, as inevitable, as something that is happening to you rather than something you are choosing. Finally, there is, this is just common sense. The phrase transforms a particular interpretation into universal wisdom. It transforms a choice about how to see something into an observation about how things are. When someone says, it's common sense that you should be careful, or it's common sense not to take unnecessary risks, they are presenting a very particular worldview as if it were obviously true. Common sense varies enormously. What seems obvious to one person seems obviously wrong to another. But the phrase presents one interpretation as though it were the only possible interpretation. What all these phrases share is that they do not argue. They do not invite discussion. They announce. They declare. They transform interpretations into facts, possibilities into impossibilities, choices into necessities. They sound reasonable. They sound wise. They sound like simple observation. And because they sound this way, you accept them without recognizing that you are accepting them. You do not experience them as words. You experience them as reality. And the moment you experience them as reality, the space that awareness created collapses. These are the phrases that return you to the system, not because they are false. Many of them contain elements of truth. But because they are too effective. They are too good at closing down inquiry. They are too practiced at transforming particular observations into universal laws. They operate so smoothly that you do not notice their operation. They sound like your own thinking. And so you repeat them, defend them, live inside them, never fully recognizing that you are being spoken through rather than speaking. The work that lies ahead, and it is not work in the sense of effort or struggle, but in the sense of simple, ongoing attention, is to develop sensitivity to these phrases, to notice when they activate, to hear them not as truth, but as operations, to recognize the moment when the space begins to close because one of these formulas has arrived to restore the system's totality. You do not need to fight them. You do not need to replace them with better phrases. You simply need to notice, to see them operating, to hear the moment when your authentic engagement with the situation is interrupted by a pre-recorded formula claiming to be wisdom. The moment you can distinguish between your genuine observation and the formula pretending to be observation, something has already shifted. The formula continues to operate. The phrase continues to be available. But it no longer possesses the same invisibility. It has been seen. And what has been seen, however briefly, can never be entirely unseen. Epilogue. Nothing to do. You have finished a book about language, and now you may be waiting for something, waiting to understand what comes next, or how to apply what you have read. This expectation itself is worth noticing. It is the expectation that understanding must lead to action, that seeing must lead to doing. This is how language teaches you to think about change. But there is no method here. There is no technique to apply. If you are waiting for these things, you may already sense that they are not coming. It is entirely possible that nothing has changed. Your thoughts continue as they always have. The formulas still activate. The familiar phrases still appear. Your sense of who you are remains fixed. And if this is your experience, it is completely normal. Understanding and freedom are not the same thing. It is also possible that something has shifted, though perhaps not in the way you might have imagined. Certain thoughts may sound different to you now. You may notice them arising before you identify with them completely. You may hear a phrase and, for a fraction of a second, recognize it as a phrase rather than as truth. Then the thought reasserts itself, and you are submerged again. But it will have happened, and it will continue to happen, unpredictably and without your control. These moments are not achievements. They are not signs of progress. They are simply moments in which the system becomes visible. You do not create them. You do not maintain them. They are not yours to manage. Language will not disappear. You will continue to live inside it. The parasitic formulas will continue to arise. The automatic phrases will continue to activate. The system will continue because language is the substance of your consciousness, and consciousness is not something you can step outside of. And yet, something has occurred in the reading of this book. Not because it contained secret wisdom or hidden knowledge, but because you spent time with a clear description of how language operates. You followed the logic of how formulas reproduce themselves. You felt the difference between being inside a thought and observing a thought. You recognized the phrases that most reliably close down possibility. And exposure, by itself, changes something. What it changes is not your life. It changes the texture of your attention. Your language may continue exactly as before, but you may find that you listen to it slightly differently now. The words may sound a little more like words, and a little less like the voice of truth. This is not an achievement. It is simply a shift. The system will reassert itself. There will be days when you forget entirely that any of this exists. Days when you are completely submerged in your thoughts, your narratives, your certainties about who you are and what is possible. You will not notice the formulas. You will simply live inside the system. This is normal. This is how it works. And if, in the future, you find yourself noticing a thought as it arises, hearing one of the phrases that closes the space, and in that noticing experiencing a moment of distance, a moment of freedom from complete identification, you will understand what this book was really about. Not about changing anything, simply about the possibility of seeing clearly for a moment how what seemed like reality is actually made of language. Clarity by itself is enough. You do not need to be transformed. You do not need to become a different person. You simply need to see, as clearly as possible, what is actually here. And that is where it ends.